Welcome, everyone, to the fifth episode of The Right Side of Maybe, the podcast at Global Guessing where we talk to elite forecasters to learn from them and to dive deep into a particular forecast where they got to the right side of maybe before the rest of the community. In this week's episode, we are thrilled to be joined by one of the best forecasters out there, Datscilly. For background, Datscilly is the number one forecaster on Metaculus.com, beating out the second place forecaster by more than 30% in terms of overall points. Datscilly also placed second in IARPA's recent Geopolitical Forecasting Competition 2, in which he won nearly $50,000 forecasting geopolitical questions on the future. It is an absolute pleasure to have him on the show today, and I'm sure we will learn a lot of amazing things. So, Datscilly, welcome to the show.
Hi, Clay. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you. So let's sort of start at the beginning. Like, how and when were you first introduced to this concept of quantified forecasting, and when did you sort of start diving into this and really working at in improving your skills?
Um, so I learned about like quantified forecasting from the rationalist community. Um, there's a time when I was reading Less Wrong, like the old Less Wrong website, and then later on Slate Codex. And on the sidebar of Slate Codex, there was an ad for Metaculus. And so I clicked on it, and for some reason I must have registered, but I didn't do anything sometime in the summer of that year. So that was like 2017, I guess, um, or 2018. Um, let's
And
see.
then sort of like, yeah, like what if you sort of got introduced to Metaculus from Slate Star Codec? I'm guessing you saw some of the forecasts that he has done on his blog, and then what sort of got you into forecasting the actual questions on Metaculus?
Uh, so on Slate Codex, there was a blog post. Yeah, it was like around September 2017, advertising a cryptocurrency contest with so like the first place is like 1 ether, and then uh, yeah, so that got me into actually um, making my first forecast on Metaculus.
How'd you do in that first competition? Were you a natural savant from the start, or was your first foray into forecasting a humbling experience?
So in that contest, I thought I was doing well in the very beginning. Like, yeah, maybe I was like in the top places and like one or two questions resolved. But yeah, I lost hundreds of points in some questions where I predicted like 90% of something to happen and it didn't. So yeah, that was when I've like learned the bitter and necessary lesson of overconfidence. And yeah, so I didn't do well on that contest.
And only so you started forecasting in September of 2017, and then about a year and a half later is when the IARPA Geopolitical Forecasting Challenge 2, not competition, sorry, started. And you go from never doing forecasting 18 months ago to coming in second place in a 250,000 prize pool competition 18 months later. What did you think was sort of most critical for improving your forecasting skills during that period? What was sort of critical to your development? Because you went from never forecasting to then coming in second in the IARPA competition. That's incredible. So, was there particular things that you worked on or read that you found really sort of helped you develop those skills?
Yeah, yeah, like I can summarize what was most important for my development, answering the question. But like 18 months is like a really long time. And yeah, like, so there's like from the beginning, when I first seriously started making a lot of forecasts, that was like maybe January or February 2018. So a couple months after the cryptocurrency contest ended. And yeah, somehow I decided that I would take it seriously and yeah, and I would just make predictions, um, like, without like too serious, without like taking it too seriously. Sometimes I would just um, like read the question, struggle to understand it, and it feels like, oh, don't know. So like 50%. And yeah, the main struggle is getting past that point, I guess. And yeah, in the beginning, I was like really interested in forecasting, and I wanted to after after getting feedback, like after my first questions resolved, and I got an idea of like you know about how good I was or where I could improve. After that, like first couple of months, I wanted to, yeah, I thought I could get better by like teaming up with someone or meeting other forecasters. So then actually, uh, a bit less than a year after I started seriously forecasting, like I'm in the East Coast, and I like flew to San Francisco to like a in-person meetup.
Oh wow.
It was, yeah, it was branded as a Metaculus meetup, but it was actually led by people who was creating the AI.Metaculus project. They wanted us to make AI predictions.
Got it. And
Uh,
so you said you first sort of just did forecasts by just sort of like looking at the question and just putting down a number, and I think that's how a lot of people forecast. In the first episode of the series, we talked with Peter Herford, and while he said there's some forecasts where he'll spend 30, 45 minutes an hour forecasting, oftentimes he'll spend 5, 15 minutes. And our colleague at Global Guessing, Mikhail Dabrowski, he has this concept of a minimum valuable forecast, that there's a certain amount of effort needed to be put into a forecast to make it a real learning experience for improving your forecasting. Did you find that there were certain things that you did either during the forecast or after looking at it that you felt you learned more from versus just making like a simple forecast? Would it be like if forecasting by putting in the base rate or putting in, different factors that would cause you to sort of rethink your initial and starting hypothesis? Like, were there certain aspects of the forecast, of forecasting, that when you did that, you felt improved your development of forecasting? Does that make sense?
um, well, I'm not sure that there was one. It's more like my response to the minimum value of forecast concept is that almost any like amount of work or effort, yeah, like counts. Like then, yeah, it helps you get better. It's more like on a continuum of like how much practice you get. And
Would
what
you say?
matters is like
Sorry.
whether, yeah, what matters is whether like you stick with it. Like, so like being persistent. So that when you do get feedback, like months later from when you make the forecast, like you go over it, you remember it, and then yeah, and then you try to learn from it.
Interesting. How much time do you spend forecasting every week? Like on average, obviously it'll change week to week. And like, how do you spend that time in as you're forecasting? How much is spent looking for questions, looking for information, looking for data? Like, yeah, what is your forecasting schedule like? Say.
Um, so when I was asked this before, I said, oh, about an hour a day. But I guess maybe sometimes it can be like 2 hours a day, so like 14 hours a week, um, but somewhere around there. And I guess it depends on how motivated I am and how enthusiastic I am about forecasting. So I was really enthusiastic for like yeah, multiple years. Like the first year for when I did IARPA and for when COVID happened. And it was only like last year in the fall that um I finally yeah, I reached first place on the leaderboard. And I guess that just kills the motivation a bit. So I just try to um, put in a medium amount of effort that I know it's hard for people to catch up. Um, right. And oh yeah, so what was the thread of this question? Like,
Yeah, just like spent like also, so you spend 14 hours, on average
oh yeah.
forecasting, less so now. How do you spend that 14 hours like with the forecasting? Like how do you sort of tackle, a forecasting problem? And then like how many questions do you think you'll forecast uh in those 14 hours? Both like new forecasts as well as sort of going back and updating current forecasts that you might have going on.
So I guess I can keep up with Metaculus, like with all the questions in Metaculus weekly. Maybe not predict on all of them. Like I might not predict on questions that are resolving uh, that are closing a year in the future. I might leave that for later. But on all the other questions, I predict on them. Or like for some range questions where the probability is like super spread out and basically there's no point value in them, then I would like delay, yeah, like defer predicting on. But basically, I look at like every single question, and yeah. So in order to keep up with all the questions on the calculus, maybe there's like 10 to 20 questions a week, probably less than 20. And so new questions, yeah, I I just go through them, and by now I already um, have a lot of like background on most question. Like um, I already set up, I already have a practice intuition, so I can usually quickly make an initial forecast for most questions, and only sometimes I'll do research that's beyond like the data source that's linked to the question. But in the past, when I was newer, yeah, I tended to do more research. I tended to like sometimes a question would be completely new to me, and I would be learning about a lot of new topics from Metaculus questions, and that's one of the appeals of forecasting on Metaculus to like
Yeah, a
to
very
learn
wide
about the
range
world.
of subjects. Yeah, you definitely learn about a lot of different areas. I think we were talking about that in our Global Guessing Weekly podcast with Philip Orchard. Just that this act of forecasting, you're just being exposed to so many new subjects and learning a lot of different things, and that's one of the exciting things about forecasting. It's not only testing your beliefs, but also just learning about a lot of interesting things that I think otherwise we probably wouldn't have the same level of understanding about.
Yeah, and it's also I also said it's like a news source for me, and yeah, I don't read the news, so this is yeah, and I don't have like geopolitics knowledge or like background knowledge that maybe other forecasters would have. So yeah, like yeah, so my news is like from attack list, and sometimes uh yeah, like breaking news will come in the attack list comments, like from Jay Galt or something.
Yep, yep, definitely from Jay Galt. If there's gonna be breaking news on Metaculus, that's where it's coming from. Um, so now I kind of want to shift and talk about sort of some specific forecasts. Before getting into one forecast, I want to talk about this IARPA geopolitical Forecasting Challenge 2 that you were a part of and that you placed second place in, and won a lot of money on. So you're a top-ranked forecaster on Metaculus. You placed second in this competition. What did you sort of attribute to your success in a forecasting tournament like this IARPA Geopolitical Forecasting Challenge 2? There were obviously a lot of talented forecasters in there. Third place, you said before we started recording, was a super forecaster. So how do you think you ended up doing well? And do you find that the skills that are successful for forecasting in a competition to be different than forecasting individual questions on Metaculus? And could you also just sort of provide our listeners with sort of some information about like what the tournament was like as an experience and in terms of the questions that you were asked to forecast?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a yeah. That's a
Big question, yeah.
yeah. Seems like a lot to go. So um, yeah. What do I what do I attribute my success on this competition to? Well, I guess I would attribute it to getting a lot of practice on Metaculus. Like, yeah, so like I said, a year and a half is like pretty long time, and I was really interested in forecasting the whole time, and yeah, so I got a lot of practice on Metaculus, and yeah, and the other thing I would attribute my success to um, is kind of I guess leaning on my strengths and on my yeah on like my forecasting approach where I like cover my weaknesses. So since I don't read the news and I don't have knowledge in politics or geopolitics or foreign countries, then I have to rely on everything else, like everything else that I can try to use
Could you talk
to
about that a little bit about like what that process and what your strengths are?
yeah. So so my forecasting approach is really like to rely on hard data, like rely on data and to use uh, the outside view, like to rely on the base rates and less weight on like uh, the specific details specific to a question on specific judgments on how like the political actors will behave or things like that. So yeah, here right. So yeah, so to get the data, I do web search. I do research when encountering a new question, and I'm careful when making my first judgment on a question. So I take it slow, and I don't jump to conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And then only over time, as I process the information that I read, and also thinking about the the community median. So the median that we're supplied with and the question the uh, like comments. So here's a good time to talk about the structure of the IARPA tournament. So this is the IARPA Geopolitical Forecasting Challenge 2. And in Challenge 1, yeah, they already had Challenge 1. And actually, they're both similar in structure. Um, the the goal of the tournament is to kind of find better machine learning algorithms for aggregating predictions. So there's going to be a bunch of predictions coming in from Amazon Mechanical Turk. So they just pay people on Amazon Mechanical Turk to make predictions. And actually they pay people like a long time to make one question, like spend at least 1 hour to make one prediction.
And how much do they pay the Turkers for that? Do you know?
Well, higher than the mechanical chart average because maybe yeah, they go for like the officially like approved Turkers who have been Turking for a long time or something. So like, but still not that high, like $9 an hour, 10, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't remember exactly. So yeah, with the structure of the tournament,
Welcome to the 14th
that was their
episode of the
intent.
Global.
And when I read about the tournament in the beginning, um, yeah, so it was my brother who introduced me to the tournament, and he's a data scientist. So he thought he would like tackle the algorithm side. But after like working through the first couple of predictions, like a couple of weeks or month in, yeah, my brother couldn't get any headway in. And basically, I've been practicing on being like a good judgmental forecaster for such a long time now. And yeah, so my approach was just to use my own judgment. And the tournament organizers, they said on the forums that, oh, they didn't think that people would be able to like manually like use their judgment to predict on like 300 like 300 plus questions and still have good performance, but apparently not because the top three places in this tournament were judgmental forecasters, just like super forecasters. While the fourth and fifth place were like they're like people who use algorithms,
Mm.
and they were probably like they probably predicted. Participated in the first competition as well, where like I guess those people use algorithms. Um,
So you really sort
right.
of like this sort of like fluid intelligence that you were able to have is what made you do really well versus algorithms, which are much more static. That's something that Balkan, no, not Balkan Devlin, sorry, Pavel Atanasov and Regina Joseph sort of found with their human forest competition and the work that they've been doing at Pitho is that humans are actually really good at forecasting and quite frequently beat um, machine models and algorithms in large part because much fluid and much easier to sort of pick out things for in individual cases. Machine forecasting might be great for weather where there's a lot of clear scientific laws and a lot of evidence, but when it comes to geopolitical forecasting, and it's very much more so art than science, that humans really tend to do a lot better than machine models, and it seems like that's what your experience was saying as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I think is that the problem with the machine prediction aggregation algorithms was that the mechanical Turker predictions weren't they weren't good enough as a crowd. So yeah, like the quality of the predictions wasn't high enough. So there wasn't anything there wasn't any machine there's no machine learning algorithm that can like make up for that when like the signal isn't there and like it's drowned out by the noise. That's what I think. And yeah, I think Regina Joseph and I
Pavel
probably
Atanasov.
share and and her collaborator. We probably like yeah have similar views. So in like the panel no, in uh, so after the competition ended, there was a kind of like a meetup. What do you call it? Like when they announce the results and like people get to present. Yeah. So like we travel to Washington
Oh
D.C.
wow.
and and in some kind of like small like hall, like presented our things. Yeah, so I met Regina Joseph there, and also I also participated in Human Force. So yeah, I can say that we probably have similar views. And yeah, she was like a consultant to one of the mm, university teams in not in a related but not the same IARPA competition.
For USC, I
And
think.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. She was a uh, uh, yeah, she consulted for USC. So yeah, so her approach was to basically to train the, uh, the forecasters, to train the mechanical turkers in base rates, just to like present them with the base rate, to tell them what how to yeah what like how to use historical data, and yeah, like to train them in like the type of uh yeah
Like the best practice, yeah, like
yeah, like best
updating your beliefs
practices
in
that
small steps
we
and
learned from like um the early IAPA like TEDlock kind of learnings early on. Yeah.
from
So
GFC1, yeah.
yeah, I really learned about all that stuff before I did Metaculus. And yeah, so one thing is that I tend to read about a lot of things on the internet early on, but I didn't have any like opinion on how effective forecasting was, or yeah, how effective quantified forecasting was when I first read about it. And then only later, when I actually did it, then I used that knowledge. But yeah, so I have background like that.
One question on the IARPA forecasting competition before we focus on when we talk a little bit about a specific forecast was you said you referred the community median from IARPA. Were you also like looking up to see if there were similar questions on Metaculus or Good Judgment Open using something like MetaForecast or just your own research to sort of use that information to make your forecasting decisions? Or
Uh, yes, so I definitely try to do that when available. So there are only a couple of questions that had like clones or similar questions on Good Judgment, and on Metaculus for GFC1, the Metaculus team actually cloned some questions over from GFC1, which the
do you know if you did
GFC1
better on
organized.
those? Sorry. Do you know if you did better on the questions that had clones on Metaculus or Good Judgment?
Uh, yeah, I think Metaculus did a bit better because they were more similar to
I meant like your
my predictions.
forecasts.
Um,
Like when you were forecasting a question that you could then also look up on Metaculus and see what people were saying there. Did you do better on those questions versus the questions that didn't have a Metaculus pairing? Like in
um,
terms of like your Briar score, you know?
um, like comparing me to maybe
So like
the
your question on
competitors.
question A that had a question on Metaculus versus question B that didn't have one. Did you do better on question A's generally over question B's? Like if you had the Metaculus question to reference, did you do better? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just like whether it helped at
Mm-hmm.
all. Yeah, I do think it helped a bit, specifically because on GFC2, there wasn't going to be any cloned questions in Metaculus, but I manually posted over some. And that was going to be my strategy in the beginning. So there's multiple reasons why I didn't like clone like a whole bunch of questions. I only cloned
Took too long.
like 13. Um, yeah, like the two reasons were the GFC2 team didn't like it. They didn't want me to like mass share the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the other reason was it didn't help as much as, yeah, it wasn't necessary to as part of my core strategy. Later on, I already knew that I could do pretty well and not break the rules, and it only helped a bit. So mainly I focus on posting over the questions where I was least certain about, like the most difficult questions. So yeah, so in that way it helped. But it also didn't help because for the majority of questions, me and Metaculus basically agreed
Mhm.
on what the prediction should be. And yeah,
That makes sense. All right, so
and
now let's sort of focus on one sort of specific forecast. I just want to get some of your feedback. So I think there's some interesting things we can learn both about you, but also about how other forecasters work and what they miss by turning our attention to a forecast that you got to the right side of maybe on much faster than the community during the GFC2 competition, which was asking whether an Ebola health worker would be injured or killed within I believe, a 6-month period in the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. The question was asked in the context of violence that occurred in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, if you guys are watching the video, you guys will see that from the beginning, the community median for this question started off at about 50%, whereas Datscilly started off at about 33%. And then over time, Datscilly updated his forecast, trending downwards, reaching about a low of a 10% likelihood. Meanwhile, for about 4 months, the entire community was more or less set around the 50 to 60% forecasting range and only updated much later on to match up where you were. And ultimately, the question resolved negatively, hence why you were on the right side of maybe. Could you discuss what your general approach to your initial forecast on this question? How did you sort of arrive to it? And why do you think you started off on a much lower number than the rest of the Metaculus community?
yes. So yeah, so this question, like reading this question, the question title is it's like a mouthful. So yeah, basically what this question is asking is in all the other countries like surrounding the Democratic Republic of Congo, yeah, DRC, all other countries surrounding the Congo. So in the Congo, that was where the Ebola outbreak was happening, where all the cases was happening. In the other countries surrounding it, uh, would an Ebola health worker be injured or killed while working in those countries outside there? Yeah, which is roughly asking whether the disease will spread there and whether the attacks that have happened in the Congo will also happen in those other countries. And yeah, so my approach was to look at the data. I looked at the Ebola cases over time. Um, yeah, and I also tried to look at past Ebola outbreaks. That was less helpful. So yeah,
And that indicated to you
so
about like a 1/3 likelihood just based on that data?
yeah, so actually, I broke down the question into like a kind of conjunction, like the will Ebola spread from DRC um, to a neighboring country, and then if so, will an Ebola health worker be killed or injured in a health facility? Yeah, so both of those things had to happen, and yeah, after like doing my research, I came to like a first judgment of like what roughly, like I didn't know, like I wasn't sure, but like roughly 50% of both outcomes happening.
Mm-hmm.
So first that was going to be 20%, but then due to the median of mechanical Turkers, which was way up at like 90%, I didn't want to get the question really wrong and lose a lot of points. So I started at 50% for the geopolitical contest. For that, I just guessed 50% while they were at 90% for like from I guess like for the first month. Yeah. So for my initial prediction, it was 50%, and then later on, I cloned the question to Metaculus like a month yeah, a month or two like after the question had already existed. And yeah, and the Metaculus question median was much better. It was like
They started off at
50,
50 where
yeah,
you were, yeah. But
yeah,
then
like
you started off at
55.
33.
Yeah, and then by then I already moved to 33 after, yeah, looking at the data.
Was
And
that getting confidence that, like, sure, the mechanical Turkers were at 90%, but Metaculus is 50, so I feel more comfortable going further down because, there's this large base of people that at least is close enough to where I want to be that I feel safe enough going down to 33. Is that a
yes, yes, definitely. Though I don't remember all the details, but yeah, that would be something that I would do. Uh,
um I want to get back. I want to circle back to how you forecasted this and what your knowledge of Ebola was. But the first thing that comes to mind to me looking at this graph is something that uh, I think Andrew and myself are guilty of at Global Guessing sometimes, and that we've also seen on these other platforms where it kind of seems like people on Metaculus kind of forgot about this question for a while because there's a really flat bar when it comes to what the what the 25th percentile is, what the median and what the 75th percentile of forecasts are over time. The only time they sort of dip is when you make updates going down, and that's affecting the 25th percentile range. So, you know, do you think the biggest sin that forecasters made was not going back to update their forecasts? Do you think that what made you successful is that you made small, frequent updates to your forecast? That's what the research of Pavel Atanasov and his co-authors, found that the best forecasters, one of the traits that they do is that they make small, frequent updates to their forecasts that keeps them on the right path to getting to the right side of maybe. Do you think that that's what got you going and kept you on the right side of maybe? Um,
mm, uh, yeah, I think making frequent forecasts is definitely like um, like a simple and like, yeah, there's no judgment involved. Yeah, way to make better predictions to get a better score. Um, yeah,
and
and it's definitely one of the like better like, yeah, it's one of the top forecasting tips.
just
Um,
to update, yeah. And then another thing that Mikal had pointed out when he looked at this graph and did his analysis was, and looking at the Metaculus comment, is it seemed like the biggest signal for the community to update was not actually news, but the lack of news. Is that something that you were sort of doing with your updates when you went from 33 to 20 to 15 to 10? Were those updates based on news, or were you updating based on lack of news and eventually sort of the Metaculus community? I think it was Simon M, which would be quite fitting because he's one of the more active forecasters, sort of pointed out, hey, there hasn't been any news, maybe we should all lower our forecasts, and then the
oh
community
yeah, it was
followed.
A boys. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
Simon wasn't here at like, yeah, years ago, but yeah. So yeah, do I think
Like,
updating?
were you updating based
Yeah.
on the lack of news?
Oh yeah. So updating based on that, based on no news is, yeah, like kind of, yeah, one of like the, yeah, like the earlier things you learn when you get into forecasting. So yeah, so I guess this would be addressed to people starting out, that you should update frequently and also update due to no news. Um, um, uh, yeah, and so like, but I think this is like should be a fairly basic or well-known thing in the forecasting community, because this is one of the more common source of comments you see on Good Judgment. Just like people like like going to 5% because time passes. Like, yeah, just because time passes and the Ebola outbreak hasn't spread. And yeah, yeah. There's two things I'll add to the updating frequently kind of topic. of discussion. One is that you don't need to update like every week or even that frequently. Like just 3 or 4 evenly spaced uh, predictions is sufficient to capture most of the value of the points. So yeah,
Yeah, it looks like you were updating every sort of 6 weeks on this question.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, and that's with me like caring a lot about yeah about like performance, about doing well for a contest, and yeah, so that's one thing. Like yeah, at least do the beginning and the end, and also try to do one in the middle. So the difficulty with updating often is that there's just so many questions, and so you have to trying to find like how to make valuable use of your time. Um, and the other thing with updating frequently is that yeah, so in these uh, experiments or studies, like I guess they found like some statistical correlation between updating frequently and performance or something like that, because updating frequently is something that you can measure, while like caring a lot and like putting a lot of effort isn't something you can directly yeah, you can't directly measure that. So updating frequently is, I guess is a proxy for
Mm.
um, for just
Effort and
caring.
caring. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That
Yeah.
makes a lot of
So
sense.
then if you just care, and then most of the time you'll be going back to these questions.
What is that what does it say that like the best way, like the number one thing in a forecasting trait is just caring? Does that to you say that we are a long ways away of like maximizing our forecasting potential? That there's a lot of different things down the line that we can do to improve our forecasts. If right now, like one of the best things to do is just to really care about it. Like for instance, if I were to say like what's the best way to get good at baseball, um, very rarely would the number one trait be just caring about baseball, right? That is sort of one of just like the first order things, but it seems like forecasting is still very early in terms of us figuring out how to get better at it. Do you think I'm off there? Or do you think that's something that like there's still a long way that we can go in terms of getting better at forecasting and learning new techniques?
Uh, yeah, the overall like idea that you're speaking to about that we're early in forecasting. Yeah, I agree with, because even when I first got into forecasting, and then I reflected on it after getting like feedback from the first questions resolving. Yeah, I felt that forecasting was something that anyone can get into if they were motivated to. Um, it doesn't require like a lot of deep knowledge with many. Yeah, it's not like math where there's many like layers of studying or knowledge, but rather, yeah, you just start basically from almost nothing, and yeah, you make your own judgment and you get feedback and you learn. And yeah, so that part I would definitely agree with. Though it's not that like just caring is like the number one thing to do in performance in a forecasting contest, or a small number of questions where you really care, and yeah, that you really like focus your effort on. Yeah. So it's more like caring is important for like yeah, updating on like forgetting Metaculus points in general, or like climbing the leaderboard on Metaculus, or good judge or good judgment. And there, yeah, just being motivated and spending a lot of time in it matters, because there's just like a deluge of questions. There's just so many questions, and
Hmm.
um, yeah, if you have other things in your life and other things that take your attention, usually it's hard to predict on all of the questions and to update on them. So yeah, so it's not
Yeah, no,
mm,
you're right. I mean, I was being a little cheeky and short there. That's you're definitely correct there. It's not just being passionate about forecasting. That's the most important thing. Um, Real quick though, before we get into some sort of like concluding thoughts on forecasting and advice for new and experienced forecasters, just I think this is probably the most interesting part about this forecast. You know, you got to the right side of maybe before the community and you stayed there. You didn't, you know, change your beliefs. We've had, you know, we've talked to forecasters who get to the right side of maybe and then they pull back and then they get back to the right side of maybe, but you know, they'll reach their real confidence and then dip away, and you didn't do that. Did you have any knowledge of Ebola or conflict in Africa before you started forecasting this question?
so no, I didn't really have much knowledge on Ebola, and I didn't know about what was happening in the Congo. And then from the question, so from this question, I did learn um, that there was an ongoing conflict in the Congo. It
Mm-hmm.
might have been a civil war, but yeah, it's been some time now, and I'm not sure whether it's a civil war. But there's an ongoing conflict that made it difficult for the health workers to do their jobs, and so that was what I guess maybe the people who were wrong and predicting at 90%, they were maybe overly focused on the geopolitical aspect.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing I like. And and because I didn't know about this, and I had like
So then it couldn't bias you because you just weren't aware of it. Yeah.
I wasn't biased because I didn't um,
That
because
wasn't a
I didn't
signal
have
that you were
prior knowledge.
considering. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whereas if you were someone that, you know, studied international relations and focused on that, you have more understanding. But if you have a bias in terms of interpreting what that signal is, it could lead you to give a number like 90% or something.
Yeah, and then about Ebola, I guess I do have like some knowledge in like biology or diseases. So like I didn't have like detail. Yeah, I didn't study Ebola specifically, but I guess I kind of vaguely knew um,
Yeah, because it was in
uh,
like the news and
before before predicting on this question that Ebola was like deadly. It like causes people to like cough out blood and things like that. But usually it wouldn't like it wasn't like it's not like the most infectious virus like because it's that like because it kills quickly and yeah. So I guess I kind of had an intuition about that. But even though with that intuition, I didn't like lean very hard on it.
mm-hmm.
Mainly, I looked at the data uh, on whether the cases were increasing. And right, so I looked at the the Ebola cases for this specific outbreak, and I also tried looking at past Ebola outbreaks.
Mm-hmm.
And the past Ebola outbreaks, it didn't end up helping that much because what I tried to do was look at whether the past outbreaks, whether they spread out of their starting countries, you know, whether they were confined to one country or they spread out. Uh, that was only like a week kind of signal. So the only helpful thing was the rough size of the past outbreaks compared to the size of this outbreak.
Mm-hmm.
And even that doesn't specifically tell me whether this outbreak will continue or whether it'll stop. But that kind of thing to look at, it's kind of like, it's like background in the back of your head. And
Yeah.
it's, it yeah, it, it, it's part of the intuition when you make your forecast. So I look at the cases and it was like almost linear from like June when to September. So like for the first couple of months, it was like almost linear, like 100 cases for 2 weeks or something like that. And then after September, the cases actually like slowed down. So after that, there was a there was an opportunity to like really lower your forecast, though I was already kind of low and I didn't need to yeah I didn't need to predict like a really true shot prediction in order to do well. I just had to like kind of be safe.
Hmm.
But yeah, after September, I'm waiting for like a couple of weeks or a month. I think that was like already a signal there for people to really look at.
Yeah, and everyone can
And
see that graph right now if you're watching on YouTube. Um, so I want to sort of conclude by getting your recommendations for other forecasters who want to be on the right side of maybe more often or get there faster than they otherwise would have. Um, one type of, but I want to, instead of doing that large sort of recommendations, I want to focus on specifically numerical questions, as you have said that you are better at those than binary questions. What is your advice for our audience for forecasting numeric questions, and how do they differ from forecasting binary ones? And what would you say sort of makes you better at the numeric ones?
yeah, so on Metaculus, my log score for numeric questions, it was better. Yeah, it's better than the community median. Um, at least my last check, like 6 months ago. Yeah. While I'm slightly worse than the community on binary questions. So on binary questions, I tend to like just stick to the community, like because yeah, I'm just doing just as well around just as well as the community. But I but I had been doing better than the community on these numeric questions. And so, yeah, roughly, the main thing I've been doing is to identify the numeric questions where it's possible to make a much narrower, much more confident forecast um, based on hard data. So yes, whether yeah,
Yes, like you'll
so
look for like
so
those questions because some questions on Metaculus, the distribution will be like really, really fat and really wide, and so those are the questions that you basically say like look for data and so that you can find a much narrower band. Um,
um, well, no, it's not just that. It's not just that that the community prediction is wide. Sometimes the correct answer is to predict a wide question. Yeah. So to identifying which numeric questions where you can get a lot of points by making a narrow confident predictions in, yeah, that is like uh, you do it the hard way. You make your own judgment after looking at the data on whether it's yeah whether it's possible or whether it makes sense to be narrow. And yeah, so one way of breaking it down is kind of like the earlier predictions, like your initial predictions, and the prediction later, like uh, when it's close to closing. And for everyone, a good thing to do is basically when the question is about to close, um, yeah, look for the questions where uh, the data like is already like hard data has already come out for partially for this question. Like if the question is about like the 4 week moving average or the 4 week average of 4 data points that's like published on some website, and like 2 out of the 4 data points have been already published, it's already set in stone, then basically you can go like, yeah, like no matter how wild the last two data points will be,
It has to be
you
within
already
a
have
certain
set.
range. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Usually at that point, you can narrow it down like much narrower than your initial prediction. So that's a place where you can get a lot of points on just like updating when the data comes out.
Do you ever find the opposite? So you were saying, and it's not just questions that have a wide distribution, but ones that not only have a wide distribution for the community, but that the data indicates it could be much narrower. Do you ever, is there the potential in the opposite, where the community forecast is very narrow, but the data indicates it could be wider, and so then you forecast those with a wider net, and that also helps you get a better numerical score?
Yeah, that also happens, and so yeah, like so I've been like predicting on attack lists for years, and for like yeah, besides like the last year or the last 6 months, yeah, like for the first couple of years, people have been erring on like being too wide. Yeah, but recently, yeah, people have been getting better at numeric predictions, and now there's errors of yeah, there's errors where people are being overconfident now. So especially in yeah, so yeah, so if people have been like predicting the last year or so, and yeah, there's probably a question or two of numeric predictions of losing like almost 100 points because of overconfidence.
Yeah. We
And
know that ourselves.
a common overall kind of maybe pattern is like the economic indicators are like swing widely due to like COVID recovery.
Hmm.
So like yeah, the the economic like indicators like
Like CPI,
numbers,
job
they have been
reports,
like
yeah.
yeah like historically very stable, but due to like yeah due to COVID, due to like the vaccine coming out and like
Stimulus and all that,
things,
yeah.
yes, things still being in flux. It's not like the historic, yeah, situation. So
And so being
yeah,
able to update
like
and to
the
realize that we sort of shifted from historic is also important, right?
yeah, so identifying when it's not the historic kind of norm, and when there's danger and there's like yeah, when you should be cautious is something else to learn about from experience. Like yeah, there was an example of um, the uh, the yeah, inflation statistics, like percent, like like way high, like inflation went up way up.
Hmm. Um, so one last question before we wrap up, and just because we've been talking so much about numeric questions, do you prefer sort of Metaculus's open-ended approach to numeric questions, where you put in a range, versus what Good Judgment and I assume what GFC2 did when it's buckets for numeric ranges? Do you have a preference? Is it both have their pros and cons? Do you have a preferred style?
Yeah, they both have pros and cons, and I like it's easier for me to predict Metaculus style with yeah with the sliders and like specifying like a full probability distribution,
Hmm.
just because that's what I'm used to and I'm trained on. Though I think for maybe new predictors, it's slightly more difficult to make a prediction, yeah, using to predict a full distribution, and it's easier to do. Yeah, it's more yeah, it's easier for new, like very beginner predictors to yeah
Do
to do the
buckets.
buckets predictions. So what are the pros and cons? The buckets predictions is the pros of the buckets method is that if the appropriate prediction is actually not a bell curve looking thing, then then it's better to do the buckets because then it's better. Yeah, then it's more natural to input a prediction with fat tails with like really wide, or at least putting like 20%, well, like 10 to 20% in the extreme outcomes. So yeah, and with the if the yeah with the Metaculus style, it's kind of like a default to predict kind of like a bell logistic curve. So when the prediction, like when the right answer is in, when you need to put fat tails, then you have to kind of like, the appropriate thing to do would be do something like make two components where one component is maybe what close to the median and relatively narrow, but make a second component maybe with full weight or half weight, much much wider, so you can get the fat tails. But that's not something that's natural with the UI.
Yeah, no. We do the same thing, but messing with those sliders can definitely be challenging at times, especially when you're trying to make it look the way that you want it to. Datscilly, thank you so much for coming on the show, for talking about your forecasts, for sharing a lot of wisdom. Where can our listeners find you? I'm guessing it's at Metaculus.
Yes, it'll be yeah. So if you want to contact me to do a forecasting session, you can find it on my Metaculus profile. Hmm.
Great. And you can find his email, which you can reach out to him to schedule such a forecasting session. And we should do the same. Have you on for a volume of Metaculus Mondays. I'm sure it'll be our most accurate forecasts if we were to do them alongside you.
Yeah, like we'll try our best on that. Yeah, no
No
promises.
commitments.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Have to stay tuned. Great. Well, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And this was the 5th episode of The Right Side of Maybe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, my pleasure. See you.